Welcome to Cut and Thrust, your podcast for the bloody and sometimes bizarre journey through the Middle Ages. Whether it's dark battles, questionable hygiene, or hair-raising rulers, here you'll get history as it really was, raw and unfiltered. So grab your sword, put on your helmet, and let's dive into the wild world of the past.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Battle Merchant podcast. I'm Hendrik.
And I'm Carmen. Today, we're talking about a topic that's often overlooked when we think about the Middle Ages.
Exactly. We are discussing the people on the margins of society. When you think about medieval social order, the three estates immediately come to mind. The clergy, the nobility, and the third estate, from peasants to craftsmen to city burghers. But what about everyone else?
Those who didn't fit into this system, they existed too. And there were quite a lot of them.
And that's exactly who we'll be talking about today. Let's start with a group that was truly paradoxical, the so-called dishonorable professions.
Dishonorable might sound like we're talking about fraudsters or criminals, but that wasn't it at all. These were people who performed tasks that were considered, how should I put it, ritually impure.
This included executioners, knackers, grave diggers,
prostitutes, flayers, anything that had to do with death, bodily waste, or animal remains.
And here's where it gets paradoxical. These professions were absolutely essential to society. Someone had to carry out death sentences, dispose of dead animals, and bury the deceased.
But these very people were ostracized. They were typically excluded from guilds, often couldn't attend public assemblies, and sometimes even had to live on the outskirts of town, though this varied by region.
In the late Middle Ages, when the guild system really developed, this actually got worse. These people sometimes weren't even allowed to sit at the same table as other citizens.
The table thing is really telling. The belief was that by sharing a table with them, especially at guild or council feasts, you would somehow become infected with their dishonor. It was even considered hereditary. How strictly this was enforced varied greatly by region.
And here's the crazy part. Some of these dishonorable professions were actually quite lucrative financially. City executioners, for example, received a fixed salary, plus payment per execution, provisions in kind, and often even their own house.
Plus all the side jobs, right? They didn't just perform executions.
Exactly. Disposing of animal carcasses, killing stray dogs, in some cities even overseeing brothels. And interestingly, some executioners also worked as surgeons. In certain regions, this was actually well established. After all, they knew their way around the human body.
Anatomical knowledge gained from, professional experience. Some became quite wealthy this way. In some places, even wealthier than many craftsmen.
But even with money, they couldn't break through this social barrier. The stigma was passed down to the entire family for generations.
The children had an extremely hard time switching to an honorable profession. Executioners' children usually married other executioners' children, or knackers' daughters. It was almost like a separate, isolated social class. Upward mobility was possible, but rare.
A truly hopeless situation for those affected.
Though we should also mention, this varied completely by region. What was considered dishonorable in one city was perfectly normal elsewhere.
Millers are the classic example. In some cities, they were considered dishonorable because they supposedly cheated when grinding grain. Elsewhere, they were completely normal, respected craftsmen.
Or linen weavers. In some regions, they were actually considered dishonorable, suspected of cheating with the yarn because they used foul-smelling animal fat from the knacker. And in some places, they even had to build the gallows. But in St. Gallen, they were the most prestigious guild. Sounds completely absurd today.
Absolutely. This shows how arbitrary these categories often were. It wasn't about the actual work, but about social constructs that had solidified over centuries.
This spatial separation was very real. Executioners often lived on the outskirts of town, near the execution site, to keep them away from respectable citizens.
Exactly. Their entire existence was designed around maintaining distance, avoiding contact, avoiding physical touch. They were even shunned at baptisms or when seeking godparents.
Socially indispensable, yet personally untouchable. A true paradox.
And this is just one of the marginalized groups we want to discuss today. There were many other people who lived on the fringes of medieval society.
Now let's look at another group, beggars. They were truly everywhere in the Middle Ages, and attitudes toward them changed completely over the centuries.
In the early Middle Ages, begging wasn't just tolerated, it had real theological significance. Giving alms was considered an act of Christian charity that helped the giver's salvation.
The poor person was, in a sense, a tool for the rich person's redemption. Sounds strange, but that was the logic. By giving, you drew closer to God. Poverty was even considered a state pleasing to God.
Monasteries and churches institutionalized this. They regularly distributed food to the needy, with fixed days and set routines. This wasn't private charity, but organized poor relief.
But then came the cities. And with the growth of cities in the late Middle Ages, attitudes fundamentally changed. Suddenly there weren't just a few beggars at the monastery gate, but masses of people streaming into the cities.
And the cities responded with, control instead of acceptance.
They tried to reduce and regulate the number of beggars. Begging ordinances were issued that distinguished between genuine and false beggars.
Genuine beggars were the local poor, widows, the sick, people who truly couldn't work. False beggars, in the city's eyes, were all those who could actually work or came from elsewhere.
And then came this beggar's token system, which was like a kind of
early welfare ID, you could say. Cities issued tokens, small badges made of lead or tin, sometimes brightly colored cloth patches sewn onto clothing.
If you had such a token, you were allowed to beg. If you didn't, you were driven out. Citizens were even encouraged to only give to those who wore the mark.
That's essentially a complete bureaucratization of poverty. Registration, assessment, issuing of badges, oversight.
In Nuremberg, such a system is very well documented. They had a begging ordinance as early as 1370. Other major imperial cities like Cologne, Augsburg or Basel probably had similar regulations. But there were significant regional differences. In some cities it was strictly organized, in others more sporadic.
And those without a token, or who came from elsewhere, were either turned away at the city gates or placed in poorhouses. Incidentally, these weren't always located outside. Holy Spirit hospitals were often right in the city center, while leper houses and infirmaries were placed outside the gates due to fear of contagion.
So spatial separation, similar to the dishonorable professions. Except beggars weren't excluded because of their work, but because of their status.
What's interesting is this shift in thinking. From poverty as a state pleasing to God, to poverty as a problem of public order. The beggar transforms from a path to salvation into a public nuisance.
And this didn't affect everyone equally.
The hospital poor, who belonged to a church institution, were often better off than those simply living on the streets. There was a hierarchy, even among beggars.
What's also noticeable, control became increasingly strict over time. In the 14th century, the regulations were still relatively loose. By the 15th and 16th centuries, they became truly systematic.
The question of deserving and undeserving poor runs through all of subsequent history.
And it shows how strongly the treatment of poverty depends on economic and social circumstances. When resources become scarce, the rules get harsher. Now we come to a group whose medieval history is particularly complex: Jewish communities. And here we really need to differentiate, because the situation fluctuated greatly over the centuries.
In late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, Jewish communities actually lived under the protection of bishops and emperors. This wasn't benevolence in the modern sense, but a legal status that allowed them to practice their religion and engage in trade.
And they served an important economic function. Since the canonical prohibition on usury applied to Christians, Jewish merchants and bankers played a central role in money lending, although Christian merchants and Italian bankers also extended credit through permitted arrangements. This made them indispensable on one hand, but also vulnerable on the other.
Dependence on Jewish moneylenders bred resentment. Those in debt didn't see the creditor as a business partner, but as an enemy.
The major turning point came with the Crusades. From the late 11th century, so 1096 during the First Crusade, the first major pogroms occurred in the Rhineland. Speyer, Worms, Mainz, the Jewish communities there were attacked and massacred.
The scapegoat mechanism. They set out to liberate Jerusalem from the infidels, and first turned against the infidels at their own doorstep.
And the theological justification was the accusation that Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus, an allegation that was exploited for centuries.
What's frightening is how this violence then
became entrenched. With every crisis, this mechanism was activated again. It was particularly devastating during the Black Death from 1348 onward.
The well poisoning legend. Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells to spread the plague. An absurd accusation, since the plague struck Jews just as hard as everyone else.
But in the panic, people needed someone to blame. And again there were pogroms, expulsions, executions. In some cities, entire communities were wiped out.
What impresses me is their cultural resilience. Despite all this persecution, Jewish communities persisted and preserved their religious and cultural traditions.
In the late Middle Ages, systematic exclusion was added. Forced settlement in designated Jewish quarters, the term ghetto only emerged in 16th century Venice, and mandatory identifying marks, which date back to the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215.
The Jewish hat, right?
That's interesting because it wasn't originally compulsory attire at all. The conical hat with the knob on top originated from an Oriental headdress and was worn by Jews as their own traditional attire in some regions, especially in German-speaking areas. In Christian art, however, it appears as early as around 1015 as an identifying mark, often with negative connotations. Jews even used it in their seals and coats of arms.
And it only became mandatory later?
As I mentioned, after the Fourth Lateran Council, a distinguishing requirement was established, but the specific implementation varied completely by region. In Germany, often the hat. In France, more commonly the rouelle, a sewn-on yellow disc. In England, saffron yellow cloth badges in the shape of the tablets of the law, representing the 10 Commandments.
So not a uniform rule, but a patchwork of local regulations.
And the level of protection also varied greatly. There were times and places where Jewish communities lived relatively safely, and others where they were constantly under threat. Some rulers protected them out of economic interest, others expelled them.
The pattern is always similar. In peaceful times, tolerance or even protection. In times of crisis, persecution. Jews as a release valve for social tensions.
And despite everything, the communities survived. They developed their own legal traditions, preserved their language, their religious texts, their identity. That's a remarkable continuity, given what they endured.
Now things get more colorful. vagrants, and traveling folk, this is a group that's often romanticized. The singing students, the free minstrels.
But we really need to differentiate here. Vagrants, in the strict sense, were wandering students and clerics. They moved between universities, traveling from Paris to Bologna to Prague, or simply couldn't find a position after their studies.
And instead of settling down, they stayed on the road, living on odd jobs, writing, singing.
Their most famous legacy is the Carmina Burana. This 13th century song collection with drinking songs and love songs, satires on the church and nature poetry.
Almost everyone knows it today, at least O Fortuna from Karl Orff's arrangement. It's so everywhere in films and commercials.
And now, a quick word from our sponsor. Feeling curious? Then head over to battlemerchant.com. They've got all sorts of medieval stuff, from costumes to armor and loads more. Totally worth a look.
And the original songs reveal a remarkably free spirit. They wrote about gambling, about wine and women, about the hypocrisy of those in power. This was subversive literature.
Later, the Wandervogel movement in the early 20th century romanticized this free lifestyle and claimed the vagrants as their inspiration. The ideal of the wandering scholar who refuses to be constrained.
Though the reality was probably less romantic. No steady income, no security, dependent on the favor of local lords.
And then there were the traveling folk in the broader sense. This included
jugglers, minstrels, acrobats,
peddlers, tinkers, knife grinders, traveling craftsmen of all kinds.
And it's important to emphasize, this wasn't a homogeneous group. A traveling merchant who regularly visited the same markets had a completely different status than a juggler who performed here today and somewhere else tomorrow.
Contrary to what you might think, they weren't completely excluded from society either. At festivals and markets, minstrels were welcome, even sought after.
They had their networks, knew each other, had connections to settle people. This wasn't a parallel world, but rather a mobile complement to settled society.
You can see this at today's medieval fairs too. Traveling merchants and performers are a fixed part of the scene, except nowadays they usually have permanent homes and just head out on weekends.
Though the historical traveling folk, many really did live on the road with carts and tents. Others used inns or winter quarters.
What was different from the dishonorable professions, traveling folk weren't automatically shunned. They were on the margins of society, but not outside it. No ritual taboo, no prohibition on contact.
The difference probably lies in their usefulness to the community. Entertainment at festivals, goods that were otherwise hard to obtain, news from other regions.
They literally brought the world with them. In an era when travel was arduous and news traveled slowly, they were a connection to the outside.
Nevertheless, there was always a certain mistrust. Someone who's here today and gone tomorrow escapes social control. That made them suspicious, even though people needed them.
So, an ambivalent position. Welcome for what they offered, but never quite belonging.
To conclude, let's look at a special category: religious fringe groups. They weren't on the margins of secular society, but on the margins of ecclesiastical order.
First, there were those who voluntarily withdrew. Hermits and small religious communities who lived in poverty and asceticism, deliberately apart from the world.
From this ideal of poverty emerged the mendicant orders. Franciscans, Dominicans, they wanted to live like Christ, without property, dependent on people's charity.
And then something ironic happened. These orders, which arose from the renunciation of worldly power, themselves became powerful institutions.
The Dominicans later took over the Inquisition. The Franciscans built monasteries and churches. The original ideal of radical poverty was institutionalized and thereby transformed.
And then there were the groups that truly came into conflict with the church.
The Cathars, for example, mainly in southern France. They rejected the entire church hierarchy, the sacraments, the material wealth of the clergy. They strived for a simple life of poverty.
The Waldensians were similar. They
wanted to preach the gospel in the common language, which the church strictly rejected.
Both groups were persecuted as heretics by the Inquisition. The Cathars were virtually wiped out in the Albigensian Crusade. The Waldensians survived in the Alpine valleys.
The difference from the church's persecution of Jewish communities was this wasn't about a different religion, but about divergent interpretations of the Christian faith. In the eyes of the church, that made it almost more dangerous.
There's one more group I'd especially like to highlight, the Beguines. I find them remarkably modern for their time.
These were religious lay communities, mainly women, who lived together in houses. They didn't take permanent vows, so they weren't bound to a convent, but they led a pious communal life. For women from good families, there were usually only two respectable options: marriage or the convent. The Beguines offered a third path.
And they provided access to education and self-determination. Beguines could read and write, they worked, they managed their own finances. At a time when none of this was taken for granted for women.
However, they too repeatedly fell under suspicion of heresy. This independence from church control was suspect.
Nevertheless, the Beguine communities in Flanders and along the Rhine existed for centuries. Some to this day.
Looking back at all these groups now, the dishonorable professions, the beggars, the Jewish communities, the traveling folk, the religious fringe groups, a pattern emerges.
The treatment of these people reflects
the values and above all the fears of society.
Yes, that's the point. Marginalized groups don't emerge in a vacuum. They are defined by mainstream society, excluded, sometimes even needed.
And the mechanisms repeat themselves. Scapegoats in times of crisis, control through marking and registration, the distinction between deserving and undeserving.
That's also why engaging with this topic is worthwhile. History isn't just made by kings and popes, but also by people on the margins.
Their stories often tell us more about an era than those of the powerful.
And that brings us to the end of this episode. We hope it was interesting and maybe even gave you something to think about.
If you enjoyed this topic, feel free to visit battlemerchant.com. There you'll find not only equipment for your historical hobbies, but also many more fascinating topics about history and the Middle Ages on our blog.
Until next time.
Bye.
And so we ride towards the end of this episode. Keep your sword sharp and your mugs full. We'll catch you in the next one.